Genetically modified mosquitoes. That does not sound good to me, but they're being released in the Florida Keys in an effort to combat persistent insect-borne diseases such as the Zika virus.
Florida residents woke up to a reality that sounds like a sci-fi movie. Millions of lab-made mosquitoes were released into the wild. This wasn't an accident. It was a massive experiment by a company called Oxitec. They claimed these bugs would save us from diseases like Zika. But then, months passed and the results finally came to light. People were worried about super bugs and hidden agendas. One of the most overlooked aspects is what actually happened to the local population. You won't believe what the data showed once the dust settled on this high-stakes trial. Experimental clouds over Florida Keys. In the month of May of the year 2021, something very strange started happening in the Florida Keys. People in Monroe County began seeing small blue boxes appearing in their neighborhoods. These weren't for mail or for trash. They were the starting point for one of the biggest biological experiments in American history. A company from Great Britain named Oxitec had finally received the green light to release their creation. We are talking about millions of genetically modified mosquitoes. Specifically, they were targeting a type of bug called Aedes aegypti. This is the main bug that spreads things like dengue fever and the Zika virus. For years, people tried to use sprays and chemicals to stop them, but the bugs just kept getting stronger. So, the scientists decided to fight biology with biology. See, here is the deal. These lab-made mosquitoes are all male. That is a key detail, because male mosquitoes do not bite humans. They only eat nectar from flowers. The plan was simple on paper. These modified males would go out and mate with the wild females.
So the OX5034 mosquito, this is what we call our friendly male mosquito. And this male mosquito really has one job, and that's to go and find invasive female mosquitoes, mate with them, and pass on to them two genes.
Because of a special gene added in a lab, any female children they had would pass away before they could grow up. Only the sons would survive. Those sons would then carry the same gene and keep the cycle going. For months, the company put out these boxes in places like Ramrod Key and Vaca Key. By the time they were done, they had let loose about 5 million of these insects. People were nervous, and that is putting it lightly. Nobody knew if this would actually work or if it would make things worse. Fast forward to the part where the results started trickling in. In the year 2022, Oxitec released their first big batch of data. They claimed that the experiment was a massive success. According to their reports, the lab-made males were just as good at finding mates as the wild ones. They traveled just as far and lived just as long. The crazy part is that they supposedly achieved a huge drop in the local mosquito population. In some areas, the numbers fell by more than 90%. This was exactly what the local government wanted to hear. They had been spending a lot of money on traditional pest control with very little to show for it. But there was a catch they didn't see coming. While the company was celebrating, a lot of people were still confused about the long-term effects. There are still many rumors in the air, but what many can confirm is that the local environment is a very delicate thing. If you remove one piece of the puzzle, the whole thing might change. Some residents claimed they were seeing different types of bugs moving in to take the place of the ones that were disappearing. One of the most overlooked aspects is that Aedes aegypti is actually an invasive species in Florida. It doesn't really belong there anyway. So, the scientists argued that removing them would only help the natural balance. Still, nobody expected this to happen, but the public pushback grew even louder as the months went by. People started asking why they weren't given a choice. If you live in a house where a release box is placed nearby, your yard becomes part of the lab. And get this, the scientists were tracking these bugs using a special fluorescent gene. If you caught one and put it under a certain light, it would glow. It felt like something out of a horror movie for many families living in the Keys. They wondered if these glowing bugs could somehow transfer their modified genes to other animals or even humans. The experts said it was impossible, but as we have seen before, science can be unpredictable. Wait, it gets better. The real kicker is that this wasn't just about Florida. This pilot program was meant to prove the tech worked so they could sell it everywhere. They even looked at places in California for the next round. But the more data came out, the more people started digging into the fine print. They found out that if a certain antibiotic called tetracycline is present in the water, the lethal gene might not work. This means female mosquitoes could survive. This is a massive caveat because that antibiotic is used a lot in farming. If these bugs breed near a farm, the whole plan falls apart. This is where the story takes a hard left because the numbers started to tell a different story depending on who you asked. While Oxitec showed high success, independent groups were worried about the lack of outside peer review. They wanted to see the raw data, not just the highlights. It turns out that tracking millions of tiny flying insects across hundreds of square miles is incredibly difficult. Just when you thought it was over, the Environmental Protection Agency decided to extend the permit anyway. They gave the company permission to keep going until the year 2024. This news hit the local community like a ton of bricks. The story was just beginning for those living in the splash zone. Synthetic biology inside local backyards. It is not that simple, though. To understand why these bugs are so special, we have to look at what is happening inside their cells. Scientists use a system that basically acts like a lethal switch. In the lab, they feed the mosquitoes an antidote to keep them alive. Once they are in the wild, they don't have that antidote anymore. So, when they pass their genes down, the female larvae simply cannot survive. This is supposed to be a very clean way to handle pests. It doesn't involve dumping thousands of gallons of chemicals over neighborhoods. In the past, Florida used planes to spray neurotoxins to keep the bug counts down. Many people hated that even more than the lab bugs because those sprays hurt bees and butterflies too. Basically, the idea is that this genetic tool is like a surgical strike. It only hits one specific type of mosquito and leaves everything else alone. But here is the catch. Biology has a way of fighting back. There is a fear among some researchers that the wild mosquitoes will eventually become resistant to this genetic trick. If the wild females start to recognize the lab males and refuse to mate with them, the population will just bounce back. This has happened before with other types of pest control. Nature finds a way to survive, and that is exactly what keeps many people up at night. One of the most overlooked aspects of this technology is where it came from. Oxitec didn't just start in Florida. They had already done trials in Brazil, the Cayman Islands, and Malaysia. In Brazil, they released millions of bugs over several years. At first, the results looked amazing. The mosquito population crashed just like it did in the Keys. But then, a group of independent scientists went back to check the area. They found that some of the genes from the lab bugs had actually merged into the wild population. The wild mosquitoes in those Brazilian towns were now hybrids. They were part wild and part lab created. And get this. The crazy part is that nobody really knew if those hybrid bugs were more dangerous or harder to handle. The company said it didn't matter because the genes would eventually fade away. But the fact that it happened at all was a red flag for many. It showed that the lethal gene wasn't perfect. Some females were surviving and breeding. This is where the story gets even weirder. When the news of the hybrid bugs in Brazil reached Florida, it sparked a massive wave of protests. People started showing up to local meetings with signs and petitions. They didn't want their home to become another failed experiment. Despite the noise, the scientists pushed forward. They argued that the new version of the mosquito, called the OX5034, was much better than the old one. They claimed it was impossible for this version to create hybrids that could survive in the long run. But for the average person living in a house that costs $500,000 in the Keys, trust us wasn't a good enough answer. They wanted proof that their kids wouldn't be bitten by something that was never supposed to exist. Even though the company said only males were released, everyone knows that no system is 100% perfect. If even a few modified females got out, they could bite. Looking back, that was the red flag that everyone should have watched closer. The company admitted that in their sorting process, about 1 out of every 30,000 mosquitoes released could be female. That sounds like a small number until you realize they released millions of them. That means there were likely hundreds or even thousands of lab-modified females flying around Florida. These females could still carry the gene and they could still bite. While the company said they weren't dangerous, the lack of transparency made people very uneasy. Little did they know, the next challenge wouldn't come from the bugs, but from the humans. Public fears and environmental outcry. Against all logic, the debate over these mosquitoes became one of the most heated topics in the state. It wasn't just about the science anymore, it was about politics, money, and ethics. A lot of people were confused about why the government would allow this without a vote. In most cases, if a company wants to test a new drug, they need volunteers. But with this, the volunteers were everyone in the area. If you breathed the air or walked in your park, you were part of the trial. This led to a lot of anger toward the EPA and the local Florida Keys Mosquito Control District. Many are not seeing the truth here when they look at the protest groups. These weren't just people who hated science. Some of them were world-class experts in ecology. They pointed out that we don't really know what eats Aedes aegypti in the wild. If dragonflies, bats, or certain birds rely on these mosquitoes for food, what happens when the food disappears? The scientists said that these mosquitoes make up such a small part of the ecosystem that nothing would change. But history is full of examples where humans messed with nature and regretted it later. One of the most overlooked aspects is the food chain. If the bats in the Keys lose a big source of food, they might move elsewhere or die off. But then everything changed when the legal battle started. Groups tried to sue to stop the releases. They argued that the EPA didn't do enough testing on how these bugs affect endangered species. The Florida Keys are home to many rare animals that don't live anywhere else. If the genetic experiment went wrong, it could wipe out a species that is already struggling. The court cases dragged on for months, but in the end, the judges usually sided with the scientists. They decided that the risk of diseases like Zika was a bigger threat than the risk of the genetic experiment. So, here is the deal. The company started using a lot of PR to win over the locals. They held webinars and gave out brochures. They tried to make the science sound simple and safe. But just when you thought people were calming down, a new set of data came out. Some independent researchers pointed out that if you eliminate one type of mosquito, another one might just take its place. In Florida, there is another bug called the Asian tiger mosquito. It also carries diseases. If the lab bugs eliminate the Aedes aegypti, the Asian tiger mosquito might just move in and breed even faster. If that happens, the whole experiment was for nothing. You would just be trading one problem for another. And that was just the beginning. The tension in the community got so bad that some residents started taking matters into their own hands. There were reports of people trying to destroy the release boxes or spraying extra pesticides around their property to eliminate the lab bugs. It was a complete mess. The scientists had to keep their release locations a secret just to protect their equipment. It felt less like a scientific study and more like a covert operation. To everyone's surprise, the program didn't stop. It actually grew. They started talking about expanding to the mainland, into places like Miami and beyond. One of the real shockers was how much money was involved. This wasn't just a small project. There were millions of dollars on the line. If Oxitec could prove their model worked in the United States, they could sign contracts with cities all over the world. The Florida Keys were just the door to a multi-billion-dollar industry. This led many to believe that the results were being polished to look as good as possible. When there is that much money involved, people naturally get suspicious. They wonder if the success is real or if it is just a good sales pitch. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Does this feel like progress to you or a mistake? Make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of hidden science. There is plenty more to uncover about what is happening in our own backyards. See you in the next one.